The worst thing that can happen to you in fantasy football is when you draft a starting running back and they end up getting injured and you don't have that running back handcuff. So today we're talking through 5 elite level upside handcuffs to have stashed on your bench, whether you have the starter, whether you don't. First player we're going to be talking about is Trey Benson. And is Trey Benson the handcuff to James Conner, or is Trey Benson going to be the actual starter? Because Trey Benson gets that early 3rd round draft capital to the Arizona Cardinals, and my man Trey Benson is absolutely electric. 4.39 40-yard dash time. It's got 116 speed score out of the University of Florida State. And while we look at Trey Benson, we look at this overall offense, we love Kyler Murray. We love the fact that they drafted Marvin Harrison Jr. We love Trey McBride. And to be honest, we pretty much love some James Conner, because in the last 2 seasons, we've seen James Conner be an absolute stud. And the reason that James Conner has been an absolute stud is because he's got a whole lot of volume. RB7, RB9, and RB13 on a points per game basis the last 3 seasons. And not to say that I don't like James Conner, because James Conner is 29 years old. But when we're going to be talking about an offense that's going to be this efficient, I think there's a lot of reason for hope for a guy like Trey Benson being able to come in and overtake a guy like James Conner, who hasn't had to really deal with a significantly talented backup running back in this offense. So really, when we look at the running back inputs, when we look at the projections for Trey Benson, we can actually see that RotoViz has Trey Benson actually projected to get 175 rushing attempts, 735 yards, 4.2 yards per carry, 30 targets, 22 receptions, 2 total receiving touchdowns as the clear RB1 in the Arizona Cardinals offense. Now, if we're looking at this, we're looking at the team inputs of them having around 610 passing attempts and only 437 rushing attempts. That really comes to the fact that the Arizona Cardinals defense, a lot of people are worried about it, so they're not going to be in a lot of good game-winning situations, which is going to cause them to have to throw the ball in that second half, really driving down that rushing attempts. Now, for a guy that is so expensive like Trey Benson, he better be a really great handcuff, because to be honest, like we said, I think a lot of people project Trey Benson to actually be the overall starter. And if that were to happen, then of course his value goes shooting up. But I think bringing him up as the first handcuff in this video, very necessary, because we absolutely love some Trey Benson. A second player that you need to be drafting as the handcuff is going to be Raheem Mostert, who goes off the board as RB28, overall player 96 on Underdog. And same thing a little bit with Trey Benson. Is Raheem Mostert actually the backup? Because if last year was any indication, Raheem Mostert had an absolutely electric year with RB4 points per game numbers, was 17.9 fantasy points per game in the 15 games that he played, 209 rushing attempts, 25 receptions for 21 total touchdowns. Now, Devon is getting drafted as a top 6-7 running back in these Underdog drafts. And for me, when I'm looking at Raheem Mostert, he might outproduce Devon, and you're getting him a whole lot later. And as much as I love all the running backs in this offense, I love Devon, I love Jalen Wright, I love Raheem Mostert. If we're talking about handcuffs, I mean, Raheem Mostert has to be the second other handcuff that we have to be talking about, because right now on Underdog, Raheem Mostert's going off the board as RB28. So he's a little bit more expensive than Trey Benson, who we just talked about, who's RB30. But we're talking about overall upside of Raheem Mostert finishing as in the top 5. We saw that last year with Raheem Mostert. No reason not to project that out this year. And when we look at the in and out splits of Devon and Raheem last year, when they both played together, Raheem Mostert averaged 18.8 fantasy points per game. When he played without Devon, when Devon was injured, 16.6. Now, the thing that we need to understand about this is both were highly efficient when they played together. And so for me, I don't necessarily project Raheem Mostert being a detriment or Devon being a detriment to Raheem Mostert. With the way that Mike McDaniel runs this offense, as long as both of them are healthy, both of them are going to get the work and the touches. And then they also brought in Jalen Wright, who I think if either of them were to get hurt would also kind of be able to take a little bit of the load. So that makes me excited for Raheem Mostert. I think he's an absolute great handcuff that you must have. Now, getting to some actual like handcuffs that people aren't projecting, that haven't really broken out at all in their NFL career. The first one's going to be Tyjae Spears. And Tyjae Spears is currently going off the board as RB34, overall player 111 on Underdog. And a lot of people, when we were talking like in the dynasty space back in January or February, before NFL free agency happened, a lot of people were saying, hey, if Derrick Henry leaves, Tyjae Spears is going to be the clear one. Well, Derrick Henry does leave in free agency, but then they do sign Tony Pollard to a pretty big deal in free agency. And so a lot of the Tyjae Spears truthers were all of a sudden like, whoa. Tyjae Spears, he's back to being just relegated to that backup role. But then we see some of the interviews with Brian Callahan talking through the fact that Tyjae Spears is going to have a role in this offense. And he was RB38 as a rookie in the NFL on a points per game basis with 100 rushing attempts, 453 yards, 4.5 yards per carry, and 52 receptions, which is super exciting. But the other thing that was super exciting for Tyjae Spears was that he was able to get RB27, a 52.9% snap share. Now that means that he was out snapping Derrick Henry on a game-by-game basis. Now they're putting him in on a lot of third downs, a lot of passing opportunities that Derrick Henry wasn't in there for. And while you might be saying, hey, Tony Pollard does succeed in that role, I think Tyjae Spears did a great job in that role last season, and he was RB9 on a target share. So we're talking about a guy that if for some reason anything were to happen to Tony Pollard as the clear bell cow in this Tennessee Titans offense, Tyjae Spears could absolutely pop off because he has the PPR upside to absolutely demolish. Now, if you're talking in your standard leagues, 0.5 reception leagues, maybe not as valuable as in full PPR, but I just think Tyjae Spears as this handcuff that you want in your backfield makes me super excited, especially with the fact that we saw Tony Pollard have pretty much a horrid year last year, and he's only getting older, and he's actually joining an offense that is worse with a lot more questions than the Cowboys did. So for me, Tyjae Spears is a handcuff that you absolutely must have, depending on if you have Tony Pollard or if you don't have Tony Pollard. My next guy that you should be handcuffing, that you should be stashing, is going to be Zach Charbonnet. Zach Charbonnet gets drafted in the second round a year ago to the Seattle Seahawks, who already had Kenneth Walker. Now, we have a whole new coaching staff, a whole new coaching regime that came in to replace Pete Carroll. So a lot of the concern is with Zach Charbonnet. He might not really have much of a role behind Kenneth Walker. Now, if you ask me directly, I'm going to still tell you Kenneth Walker is more talented than Zach Charbonnet. But Zach Charbonnet also has second round draft capital attributed to him, same way that Kenneth Walker does. And we have a whole new coaching staff that didn't draft either of these guys. So if they think that Zach Charbonnet is a better, more all-around running back, which honestly, in my opinion, I think he might be, I think Zach Charbonnet could get a ton of touches out of the gate. And especially if anything were to happen to Kenneth Walker, it makes us excited. Now, for you that are saying, Caleb, last year, when Kenneth Walker did go down for a few games, we didn't see Zach Charbonnet turn it on. And I would agree with you, because in those games, he had 10 fantasy points, 12.9 fantasy points, 16 fantasy points, but it wasn't anything absolutely crazy. But I would argue with that. In those games, he only had like a 60% snap share was the highest that he got. In those games, honestly, he probably should have done a little bit better. I agree, because he did have that 85, 61% snap share in each of those 3 games. So really projecting him as like this game-breaking, league-winning player, it's hard to do, but it's also easy to see the way that this offense is going to improve under a guy like Ryan Grubb, a mastermind from the University of Washington running the show. With this offense, makes me excited for the Seattle Seahawks, makes me excited for Zach Charbonnet as a guy that late in drafts, when you're kind of sitting there in your underdog leagues and Zach Charbonnet sitting there as RB41 over a player 133, let's take a shot at it, because if he were to be a starter, absolutely game wrecker, game league winner if he was given the opportunities and the offense were to improve. And my final player that you must be handcuffing, a handcuff that I absolutely love late in drafts, is going to be Rico Dowdle. And the reason that I like Rico Dowdle is I've liked Rico Dowdle for a long time. Actually, one of my first videos ever on YouTube that ever did well was pretty much about Rico Dowdle last offseason. And while we never saw Rico Dowdle fully emerge, we did see some life out of Mr. Rico in week 3. He had 13 fantasy points, in week 10, had 12 fantasy points in week 14, 13 fantasy points in week 18. And all of a sudden we have him still slided in as the clear RB2, but instead of being behind a guy like Tony Pollard, he's behind a guy like Zeke. And Zeke, in this second go around with the Cowboys, is pretty much just a plotter, has lost all explosion just because of the age of Zeke. And I know Rico Dowdle, South Carolina, he's 26 years old as well. They have Deuce Vaughn, but they didn't really draft or address this running back position, which makes me feel a little interested, like they're just cool to trot out Zeke and Rico Dowdle. And when we look at the splits of this Dallas Cowboys backfield, Rico Dowdle is projected to have 158 rushing attempts, 648 yards, 4 rushing touchdowns, 4.1 yards per carry, 25 targets, 18 receptions. Very similar. Like Zeke is projected 219, 158, like that could swing in Rico Dowdle's favor. And I think the upside that he has here late in these drafts, when we're talking about Rico Dowdle going off the board as RB43, 140. Now I know underdog ADP is a little bit skewed because you are looking for correlations. You are, if you're being a good player in the best ball world. But when we're looking at it from like a redraft perspective, I think the idea that Rico Dowdle is going to be the backup on an offense like the Dallas Cowboys that is super efficient. I know last year we didn't see Tony Pollard take advantage of that, have any type of game-winning, league-winning numbers. I do think Rico Dowdle could really put some weeks on the board this year as a handcuff running back that make you happy, that provide some value that you're going to be able to take him late in the late rounds, add to that depth of your running back room. And so that's what really makes me excited for Rico Dowdle. So let me know what you think of these running back handcuffs. Honestly, guys, I'm getting super excited. We are in July 4th weekend. We are absolutely approaching the fantasy football season. We're going to get July. We're just going to continue to pump out content. I'm currently working on my rankings right now, my projections for all of y'all. So I want you to know a lot of exciting good things are happening. Hit that like and subscribe button if you haven't already, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.